All right, so we're going to look at some of the diversity, a little tiny bit of the diversity in the arthropods, and a little bit with their ancestors. So these are other groups, that potentially other phyla of animals that sometimes people kind of cluster them in with arthropods. A lot of times they're their own particular group. So I'm going to talk very, very briefly about the Onicophra and the Tardigrada, because they likely shared a common ancestor with the arthropod. So depending on how it's put together, they could be the same group, or they could be their own separate group. So I'll just bring them in really quick here. Some of the things we're going to talk about specifically to be highlighting for each of the groups are going to be appendages, whether they're jointed or not, antennae, whether they have them or not, and whether they have one or two pair of antennae, body segments, if they have a certain number of them. Is it set to a specific number, or is it highly variable? Same with the appendages per body segment. If they have those, we're going to kind of highlight on those. And in addition to that, whether they're kind of terrestrial, marine, or just aquatic, freshwater, or if they have various different kind of life cycles, I'll kind of point some of those things out. So that's kind of the main thing. So some ancestor to arthropods and related groups had an exoskeleton. Now, the thing is, all these, the exoskeleton is made up of, I just tested this out, it was working, it's made up of chitin. Sorry, I was just testing it a minute ago and it was fine. All right, so they have an exoskeleton made of chitin, and now sometimes again the exoskeleton, depending on the group, and we'll just call it a cuticle. But it's a non-living outer layer secreted by the epidermis, and the chitin is the polysaccharide, sugar with nitrogen in it, and they all have this, okay? So all the groups, that's as far as chemical composition goes for making it up. Variety of other proteins and other things can be incorporated with it, different types of minerals, but it's the chitin that is a common factor in all of the cuticle exoskeletal structures. Now, the Onicophra, I mentioned this in the last lecture. Some people have put them around with the annelids, saying they share characteristic with polychaetes, and then also more recently, they've always been looked at as in between, kind of between the annelids and the arthropods, but now they've been grouped a lot more closely to the arthropods and or held in with the arthropods. So the Onicophra are a group commonly referred to as velvet worms. They are terrestrial, often predators. Now their size is like usually several centimeters, in length. So that's something else I'll mention, is kind of size and variability in size, of some of these groups. You can get a feel for it. So usually several centimeters in length, and they often found in more tropical areas like tropical rainforests and so forth. Now they usually have 14 to 40, and this is going to be pairs of appendages. And these appendages are unjointed. They typically also will have a tracheal system for respiration, similar to the insects at the other end, the hexapods. That's pretty much all we're going to cover with them. Tardigrades. Now, tardigrades are microscopic. They're typically all aquatic. However, while they have to be typically in association with water, they could be found in a terrestrial environment. For example, if you find moss in your yard and then go take the moss, put it in a little bit of water in a dish, shake it out, and we're able to look at it under a dissecting microscope, you would very likely find tardigrades in it. So the tardigrades are, remember, the moss require water for reproduction. Their sperm has to actually swim in water, so there's often water associated with them. You only find the moss in wet environments. So even though we're up on land, we're not underwater somewhere, there's still water in this environment. It's a wet environment. So they're always found in wet environments, a lot of times in completely aquatic settings, freshwater and marine environments. You can find tardigrades. So what do the tardigrades have? They have specifically 4 pair of appendages. 1, 2, 3, 4 per body segment here. So there's 8 total appendages, and they have 1 pair of antennae. So both of these groups here, I didn't mention that, 1 pair of antennae. And these are, again, unjointed appendages. So 4 pair unjointed appendages. They'll go together. And tardigrades are really well known for their ability to undergo cryptobiosis, which is essentially that the organism can remove most of the water from its body and even from its cells and go into a torpor state, a state where it's essentially seems as if it's no longer alive and it's kind of dried out. And this way they can withstand all sorts of changes in the environment without the cells dying, and then when the environment is good again, they kind of rehydrate their cells and sort of come back from that state. So they're very interesting and unique in that respect. So that's all again, they're not technically arthropods, so we're just kind of mentioning them. So now we get to here and we actually have arthropods. And so the arthropods can be broken sometimes into, these groups are subphyla as far as an actual taxonomic listing. So I've mentioned this a few times that when we talk about the taxonomy of some of the groups of organisms, it's there are terms that people change, whether they're a class or they're a phyla or they're brought in different sorts of ways. Traditionally and still today in many cases, the arthropods are such a big group with so many members and such diversity that right below the phylum Arthropoda we have subphyla, and then the subphyla get broken into classes, and then there's some major classes that have characteristics that are pretty monophyletic and are very well accepted and supported. They're members that sometimes jump around, but generally the groups are pretty well set. First group we'll talk about here is called the Chalicerada. What separates the Chalicerada from these other 3 groups here are the presence of mandibles. So these 3 groups over here, the Myriapoda, Crustacea, and Hexapods, have mandibles. So they have appendages associated with their mouth that are modified into some biting and grinding type structures, and the Chalicerada don't have that. What the Chalicerada do have is a pair of fang-like appendages called chelicerae. So who are the Chalicerada? These are spiders, scorpions, ticks, a marine group called pycnogonids. These are sometimes called sea spiders. They feed on cnidarians typically, so they use these little chelicerae to kind of pierce into a sea anemone, or coral, and then they kind of suck out the liquid, the mesoglea, kind of from those organisms in order to feed. And that's kind of the main theme, really, with all these, is that they're typically drawing out liquid material from their host. Some of them are tapping into the liquid of the host and drawing it out. Others have digestive enzymes associated with their mouth parts, so when they pierce in, that's what a tick does, is pierces into your tissue, then it secretes enzymes, actually liquefies your skin cells, and then it kind of sucks that liquid back out. So they typically aren't chewing large solid particles because they don't have jaw type structures or anything used for grinding. So they're feeding on liquids and fluids. So it's a characteristic then of the Chalicerada. Typically there's just 2 body segments, so just the sort of the head region and this thorax region, so or the cephalothorax abdomen, kind of broken into it like that. But there's typically just 2 body regions. for them. And they typically lack antennae, so there's no antennae. So no antennae, all right, in this particular group. And typically along the body, they typically have 4 pair of appendages. So the 8-legged spider, kind of the characteristic. That's also a characteristic for the other members of this group. Again, a lot that could be covered with them, but we're just trying to kind of get through a little bit of the key features, of each of them. Next, Myriapoda. Now, Myriapoda, some members of the Myriapoda are sometimes put in with the Hexapods, but generally what we have for Myriapoda, this is the group that contains organisms like millipedes and centipedes. So they're not generally considered insects. They're their own group, and I keep saying insect, and I don't have insect written up here. And we'll get to this, as this is obviously representing something like an insect here, a group I'm calling the hexapods. All right, so the Myriapoda, they do have mandibles, okay, now, like these other groups. The Myriapoda typically do have antennae, and they have a number of body segments. So these have somewhere between, say, like 15 to 22 body segments. And typically they have appendages, a pair of appendages per segment. 1 pair of appendages per segment. So they can have a fairly large number of legs. Many of them are predators on other organisms. So having mouth parts, they can bite and chew and tear things up. Most of them are also all terrestrial. Whereas I mentioned with the Chalicerada, spiders are terrestrial, the scorpions are terrestrial, the ticks are terrestrial. Pycnogonids, they are aquatic and marine. There's also another group in here I didn't talk about, which are the horseshoe crabs. They're chelicerates, they're marine. So they're both aquatic and terrestrial in the Chalicerada, but the Myriapods are just a terrestrial group. Then we switch over to the crustaceans. All right, and crustaceans are a pretty well-known group and well-studied group. They are aquatic. So both freshwater and marine. Far more marine species. They represent a whole variety of different types of organisms, from little copepods that are the basis of many of the marine food webs. So essentially photosynthesis occurs in the oceans, and a lot of that photosynthesis is by single-celled microscopic algae, right? Protists, right, that live in the oceans. The first consumers of those small algal cells are copepods, little crustacea, and then other organisms, small larval fish or other organisms, then eat the copepods, and then they're eaten by other organisms and bigger organisms. And so, but the primary productivity from photosynthesis in the oceans is largely within the microscopic algae, and the first consumers of them are usually a member of the crustacea. So they can be tiny and microscopic, or they can be incredibly large. So some very large crabs that are several meters in size. When you look at the span of their appendages, they could be about 4 meters even in stretched out completely like this. So very, very large. Possibly, but so there's a good size range, within the group. What characteristics do they have? Usually they have 2 pair of antennae, and many of their appendages are biramous. Okay, so I put that term over here. What that means is that an appendage is then branched. So there's 1, 2 branches for an appendage. That's a biramus. It ends in 2 points. A uniramus appendage, uni for 1, ends in 1 single point. That'll be important as we kind of get these last two groups, the hexapods as well. So most of the crustacea appendages are biramous, so even the antennae. All the walking legs, swimmerets, all these other structures typically are biramous. Some are much more pronounced than others. Some are very reduced in the way in which they're branched, but they typically have branched structures. As aquatic organisms, they typically have gills for respiration. So, and then that respiratory system is then associated with their fairly well-developed circulatory system, and so that they can draw the oxygen from the water. They are, like I said, some of them are primary consumers, feeding on algae. Some of them are predators. Some of them are swimming in the water column all the time. Some of them are benthic, living on the bottom all the time. Some of them burrow. Barnacles would belong to this group. A barnacle is sedentary, so it's just technically even sessile, and it's just that it attaches to one place and it could never ever move from that location. The organism can move. It has the ability to move itself, but it can't relocate itself once it's set in one spot. And it tends to then filter, its food from the water. So there's a whole variety of different, feeding strategies and environments that they live in within the oceans, and they account for, a great diversity of inhabitants of the oceans and a variety of ocean ecosystems. So this is a huge group that is possible to spend a lot of time on, but we don't necessarily have a lot of time. So that's kind of the basics for the Crustacea. Anything else? See if I'm forgetting anything to mention about them. As far as methods, everything I've already done. Something else I'll come back to mention in a minute. So now the Hexapoda also used to be really referred to as the group Uniramia. That was the older name for the group, obviously referring to that their appendages are all uniramous. They have no biramous appendages. All their appendages end in a single point. But here now we're talking about Hexapoda. We're talking about numbers of appendages. So typically they have, so we'll bring it up as the first characteristic. So 3 pair, typically of walking legs, and then usually 2 pair of wings is what we see for this group. Typically those are all associated with the thorax region. So they typically have 3 body regions. So the head, we mentioned this in the last lecture, the head, thorax, and abdomen, whereas the Crustacea, typically, for most of them, they're just the 2 body regions. Their head and thorax are usually combined into one cephalothorax, and then they have the abdomen. So here's the abdomen, and then a separate head and thorax, whereas they have the cephalothorax. So cephalothorax versus 2 separate regions, 2 pair of antennae versus 1 pair of antennae. These antennae are uniramous, and so are all the appendages, ending in a single point. These are biramous, typically ending in 2 points. Now, the Hexapoda can have, so some of them are just terrestrial. Some of them are aquatic, but there are a number of them that actually are both. So they actually have a larval stage that is completely aquatic. They develop gills, and they live in the water, and that's one form of that animal's life. For some members of this group, that is the majority of the time spent in their life, is in the aquatic stage. So say, for example, a stonefly. The stonefly nymph lives in a stream under rocks, feeding on a variety of different sorts of things. And the stonefly nymph lives there, it molts, it grows, and it grows, and it grows, and eventually it undergoes metamorphosis. And when it undergoes metamorphosis, then it kind of loses the gills, it develops more of the tracheal system for respiration, it develops its wings, and then it emerges from the water and flies off to reproduce. Some of these groups of aquatic insects, when they emerge, they exist in their terrestrial form for a very short time. Some of them, such a short time, they don't even have mouth parts to feed as the adult, they're just reproductive. So they kind of just use their wings to disperse. They find mates and reproduce. They then put their eggs into the water, and then they develop into little nymphs, and they spend most of their time. So you may only see them as a flying around, insect, but actually they have a whole other stage of their life cycle that is completely aquatic. So that's a possibility. Not all members of the group are like that. Some of them are just completely terrestrial, like caterpillar, butterfly, and they undergo a metamorphosis. They have 2 different life stages. Not all of them have 2 different life stages and undergo metamorphosis. Some of them have direct development, so that the fertilized egg just develops into a little juvenile that's very much like the adult. Maybe they don't have their wings developed yet, but they eventually do. So there's a whole lot to study. There are whole courses on, entomology, just on studying insects in particular, which is really the focus of this particular group. So again, I keep saying it. So insects. Generally what we're talking about here. And so they have wings, and the biramous appendages. They do have mandibles, like the others. And I'll mention here the hexapods, the crustacea, the myriapods, and even many of the chelicerates have, most of these as well, will have some type of eye structure. Many of them have a compound eye of varying degrees, and which, depending on how and where they live, allows them to see a variety of different things in terms of images, colors. Many insects can actually see in color ranges or frequencies that we can't see. And many of the flowers that are producing pollen, they have pigments in them that, again, as humans, we can't really see, but many insects can see, and it attracts the insect to the flower where they pick up the pollen and then carry it on to fertilize those different species of plants. So insects are important in pollination of then many species of plants. Many plants and insects kind of co-evolved in some ways in order to both provide food for the different groups of insects, and the insects provide the dispersal of the pollen for many of the flowering plants. Some of them are parasites and pests. They destroy crops and they harm other animals. Many of them are beneficial. There are some that reclaim wood from the forest that the larvae actually kind of eat and chew through the wood and digest it. A whole variety of different sorts of jobs they have, which again is really impossible to kind of cover here with the limited time we have. So really we're just focused on features. What are some of the features they have, and how does that compare to the other groups, just so you can identify them as their own specific group with a general name that's pretty well accepted that you'll see into the future. Meaning in the future, you'll probably see this name still used with the group. So that's kind of the main breakdown currently of them. Again, like I said, there's a lot of mixing of some of these, but those would be the major groups with some of the major characteristics for the arthropods. And if you want to really know more about it, there's a lot more to look up in a variety of different places about arthropods, or taking a course just on, on crustacea or just on insects.